Good evening and welcome to the Pittsburgh Public Schools November Business and Finance Committee meeting. It is Monday, November 4th, 2024. My name is Emma Yord and I am the chair of the Business and Finance Committee. Tonight, the only item on our agenda is a review of the 2025 preliminary general fund budget. At this point, I will turn the meeting over to Mr. Ron Joseph, our Chief Financial Officer, for a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yord. So tonight, the only item on the agenda is all things concerning the 2025 preliminary general fund budget. This presentation will be largely similar to the presentation last month because last month's budget workshop, the October budget workshop, was a preview of the general fund preliminary budget, and not a lot has changed, just a couple of tweaks. So let's get right into it. So for the 2025 preliminary budget, the expenditures are budgeted at $739 million, which is over a 3% increase from the 2024 adopted budget. The budget does include a $20.8 million deficit in 2025, but this deficit is reduced from last year's budget of $30 million by about $9.2 million. This budget at this point in time, based on the current assumptions, does adhere to the 5% minimum fund balance policy, the board's fund balance policy through 2025 based on the assumptions to date. It does not maintain that compliance in 2026, but through 2025 it does. And based on the current expenditures through September 30th, our expenditures are currently budgeted at $707.1 million for the current year, with a anticipated surplus of $2.6 million, but I will caution that today I did approve a $3.8 million payment for prior period tax refunds, so these numbers are subject to change. And this budget does not include a millage increase, so this budget will have a level millage to the 2024 budget. So as for revenues, going over some assumptions for the revenues for 2025 that we use for the formulation of the budget. So we're anticipating a decline in real estate tax revenue due to the property assessment appeal situation that is going on, but we are factoring in increased state property tax reduction allocation. So that's the Act 1 allocation. We are factoring in an increased allocation of that. As I mentioned, no millage increase. We are factoring in an increase in earned income revenue based on performance to date and also trends for increases over the past few years. We are factoring in slight increases in basic education and special education funding consistent with this current year's increases. If you remember from the preliminary budget, this budget assumed a level allocation to this year's, but being a little less conservative, factoring in some slight increases for the upcoming years. And whereas in the previous budget workshop, I didn't assume that the cyber transition reimbursement would continue, I'm assuming that this will continue at least through the first term of Governor Shapiro's administration. So this is a different view of all of the revenue sources that we have as a district. So as we can see, about 55% of our revenue comes from state revenue sources, with a little over 41% coming from state sources. 55 from local revenue, about 41.5 from state sources, with the remainder coming from largely fund balance, but other sources as well. So again, just showing that the vast majority of our revenue does come from our local sources, being earned income, real estate, Realty Transfer, but we do have a significant chunk of our revenue that comes from our state budget, and we're relying on roughly 3% to come from our fund balance to balance our budget. So further breakdown of our revenues for the upcoming year shows that we're budgeting for a quarter of that revenue coming from our real estate tax sources, with 26% of our revenue coming from earned income. So between those two sources, that's over 50% of our revenue. When you factor in state revenue sources or basic education funding, that accounts for over 75% of our budget. So that highlights how we're highly dependent on those three revenue sources, but in particular with real estate revenue, that is 180, but about $185 million of our budget. And with the tax bill situation and the plummeting of values in the central district, business district, that poses a threat to that revenue source that we are highly dependent on. So we're projecting in these highlighted areas in our budget for revenue, and this is not over the current projected 2024, but what we were budgeting for 2024. We see that over $34 million of that revenue is coming from those highlighted sources. So a large portion of that coming from our earned income, real estate transfer, state basic education subsidy, and also our state property tax allocation. When we look at that other revenue source, that includes the new state cyber charter transition reimbursement that was approved in the 2025-24 budget. And we are projecting that we're going to see a significant increase in our real estate tax revenue due in part to the increase in the state property tax allocation, and also due to just the reduction in assessed value due to the tax appeals that have been going on over the past few years. So when we look at the impact of assessment appeals, we see that for the last 2 years, there have been nearly $7 million awarded in refunds for those years based on those appeals. So that's $7 million that we've had to pay out of our general fund budget that we, in a lot of cases, weren't budgeting for at that level. If we look for 2024, there were nearly 1,200 appeals that were filed, and that those appeals represented about $1.5 billion in assessed value, and represented a total reduction in the actual assessed value in the district due to appeals is $157 million, and the reduction in the tax revenue that we've seen to date in these appeals has been $1.6 million. And mind you, some of those appeals or decisions are subject to challenge or appeal by the district, but this is based on the disposition mailings that we received from the county. And to date, based on the assessment information that's been filed, there are about 157 tax appeals that were filed for the tax year 2025, which is substantially down from last year. And that represents, in terms of the total assessed value, a little over half of what we were seeing from last year in terms of the total assessed value represented in the appeal. So that number is largely down. I think the moving of the appeal window from April 1st to October 1st had a good deal of that change that contributed a significant deal to that change. Now let's move on to expenditures. So for our expenditures, we're assuming that we're going to have a stable workforce, largely the same as we've had before, and not anticipating or planning for any major reductions in force. For our healthcare costs that account for our benefit, a significant portion of our benefits costs, we're looking at an 8.8 increase to the employer cost of healthcare for our employees. The budget does not, and this is something that's similar to what was stated in the budget workshop in October, that the budget assumes no school closures, school renovations, major school renovations such as additions or changes to how we deliver education in the school, the delivery model changes, as we like to call them, for the 2025-26 school year. It does assume that there will be an increase in tax refunds due from what we were budgeting for 2024 due to tax assessment appeals. It does take into account the implementation of a new cyber charter tuition calculation for special education students effective January 1st. It does assume that we'll continue the education of students in Allegheny County Jail and Schumann Detention Center that we began with this school year. And it does assume that there will be no summer boost programming in 2025. So a question that you may be asking is, why no summer boost in 2025? So beginning in 2021, we have relied on federal ESSER funds to supplement this program, but these funds concluded this past September. So So including this in the general fund budget would represent an additional $2.4 million to our deficit that is already at $20 million. That this is a significant investment, and in this program, we haven't really been able to see significant impact on student achievement from one year to the next. And this is largely, and some of this can be due, don't have the evaluation, but this is something that can be due to persistent challenges with the daily attendance and enrollment of the program. While it's a program that offers value, in some cases, at certain times, it can be not consistently attended. And we know that based on previous studies that have been done on the program, that 20-day number is very key in terms of the number of time that's needed by students in terms of attendance to have a significant effect on stemming learning loss. But this does not mean that we will do away with all summer programming. We do have a continued commitment to continuing the education of most vulnerable populations, in particular our special education students through the extended school year program. And that school-based programs that continue to have funding through their site-based budgets will continue to remain. And while we'll have no summer boost and project to have no summer boost in 2025, we'll use this time to reevaluate what summer programming will look like in the future to support student outcomes. So we want to be very intentional about the investments that we make in summer learning going forward. So this chart shows a grouping of expenditures by larger categories. So we have administration, that would be central administration or general administrative offices. We have schools, which will account for all school-based expenditures such as building, anything budgeted school buildings, and operations as a call out that includes plant operations, maintenance, school safety, some of those areas. So when we look at our total budget between schools, special education, and charter payments, that accounts for about 70% of our total budget. So if we look at this chart, this shows some of the areas of increases, red being a negative indicator. This, since we're talking about expenditures, an increase in expenditures as a negative indicator. We see that alone between tax refunds and charter school payments, that accounts for over $12 million of increases in expenditures of the total budgeted $22 million in expenditures. That charter school number is projected to increase because we just recently recalculated our charter tuition rates for the 2024-25 school year based on the PD deadline of November 1st, and we have seen an increase in those rates for our regular education students, which means our special education tuition rate is going to increase, but we do have a lower rate for our charter school students, cyber charter students who are special education students based on the new changes to the funding formula. And this will look at our budget in the view of major objects. So we see that the large expenditure categories that we have are salaries and benefits. Nearly half of our budget goes to salaries and benefits, with $21 million, 21% of that going to our charter schools. So those are two significant chunks of our budget, charter schools being one that we have limited control over. That the only control we have over that is to attract students back and not and reduce the amount of students that we're paying tuition for to charters. So I went over objects, and just to review that objects are a description of the services or items that are being purchased. So when I mentioned salaries and benefits, that's considered an object, charter schools an object, as well as debt service, telling you exactly what the budget is being spent on. So spending on debt service and equipment will be less, will be reduced from what it was last year, based on not having spent as much on equipment, being technology equipment, our laptops, because we've used ESSER funds for those, so we should be good for a few years, and debt service through various refinancings and lowering the overall spend of our capital program. We've been able to lower those numbers. But in terms of the categories that we'll see increases to, personnel, special education, transportation, charter schools, or a few benefits, or a few of those areas that we'll see increases. And this is a different look of our budget being by function. So just to skip ahead, what's a function? a function describes the activity or program the expenditure is supporting. So when we look at our instruction, we're spending about 63% on what's considered instructional spend, and that's the single largest category, with about 9% of that being on operations and maintenance. So 5% of that in debt service. So one of the things that's key to note is that our payments for charter schools are included in that instructional spend category as well by the function we have to report those expenditures for. So included in that $465 million of spend is the over $150 million that we're budgeting for charter expenditures for the 2025 budget. So when we look at the total increases in the expenditure category, as I mentioned, charter schools are included in that, and charter schools account for over half of that nearly $15 million increase in the instructional category. So when we move on to our financial outlook, based on the information I presented, we're currently right now projecting about $2.6 million deficit, but that number is likely to go down as I mentioned, tax increases, tax refund increases that have payments that I've recently approved that have yet to be factored into this, as well as increases to our charter tuition rate that will have an effect on 2024. When we move on to 2025, currently sitting at a $20.8 million deficit, which is still in fund balance compliance by over $4 million. I mean, over nearly $4 million. But when we go to 2026, we'll be out of fund balance compliance. And when we go to 2027, that'll be at a point where we will most likely run out of, it's not shown on the slide, but most likely will, at this current rate with no changes based on the current assumptions, if we don't make any changes, we'll be out of cash. So key takeaways for the 2025 budget. The budget does include a $20.8 million deficit based on projections right now, but that is subject to change based on any additional information that we can pull in and any new spend trends or revenue expenditure trends that we factor into our projections. So while the budget does adhere to the 5% balance, we can't rely on that to balance our budget in 2027. It does not include a millage increase. As I mentioned before, it assumes that there will be no closures, major school renovations, and when I say major renovations, I mean complete school renovation or adding an addition, and no delivery model changes for 25-26, and that no boost programming will be occurring in 2025. So this is a timeline of the general fund budget development and approval timeline. So right now I'm presenting the 2025 budget. Sorry, I did not catch that. It is 2025 preliminary budget. We would be very late and past the state deadline if we were approving the 2024 budget right now. Actually in 2 weeks, just shy of 2 weeks, we'll be releasing the 2025 general fund budget to caught in certain places, but not in other places. Releasing that to the public. December, we will have our special budget hearing. I believe that's scheduled for December 2nd. On December 18th, that'll be the legislative meeting where we're going to be voting on the general fund budget as well as the tax rates. And on by December 31st, we need to adopt the general fund budget. So that is the presentation. And Ms. Fjord, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph. At this point, I'll invite any questions from the board. I see any hands raised.
I have questions.
Okay, I saw Ms. Silk's hand first, and then Mr. Udine, I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Ms. Silk, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Joseph, for that presentation. I I was hoping that Dr. Walters, if you would reiterate some of the information about Summer Boost in particular, and just the reiterating the rationale with a more of a focus on the student outcomes piece about why we are not proceeding with it as we have in past years. And also, I'm wondering when the public can learn more about future plans for summer learning after your team has had the opportunity to reassess the needs.
Mr. Joseph, if you could put up that slide so I could stay on script with my comments.
Sure, 1 second. Give me another, okay, right here. Okay.
Yeah, so the first thing is really around the impact on student outcomes. So the design of Summer Boost was rooted in targeted support for improving student outcomes. We've not seen, we've had limited impact on student outcomes. We've also had significant challenges with daily attendance in Summer Boost. We've tried a number of incentives, but really what we're hearing from the participants or the teachers in space is that attendance continues to be a challenge. It's not consistent and enrollment is not consistent. Again, we will continue our extended school year known as ESY programs for our most vulnerable populations, but we do need some time to reevaluate summer programming so that the impact on student outcomes is the focus and not just creating experiences over the summer, because that was the overall intention of Summer Boost, to focus in on student outcomes. And so as stated on the slide, we have relied on ESSER funds to support this, and this is a $2.4 million expenditure annually, and that's not something that we can sustain now without really being thoughtful about reevaluating it. The timeline for that, I can't give you a date right now of a timeline for evaluation, but we will be continually working on that to create a recommendation around what it is that we plan to do in the future for summer programming.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Udine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Essentially, we are discontinuing the Summer Boost because we get no boost from the Summer Boost. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say we get no boost. I would say that the return on investment is limited.
The juice isn't worth the squeeze. Is that better?
I'll let you use whatever colorful phrasing or metaphors or whatever you'd like to use, Mr. Dean. I'll take it.
What I'm getting at is we need a better analysis or evaluation of why the Summer Boost isn't getting the boost and the attendance that we need, rather than just to get a financial assessment of what it would cost to reduce the program. Is that forthcoming?
So what we found, I hadn't shared a full analysis of this, Mr. Dean, but what we have found is the attendance has been so inconsistent that it's hard for evaluators to even measure the quality or impact of the program, because the attendance has been so sporadic that this level of to assess the treatment of the impact of the summer program is limited, because the attendance has been so inconsistent with students. It's hard to say this created an impact because the attendance was so sporadic. So it's hard to measure evaluation of a program when there's not consistent attendees.
I have a hard time buying that we can't find an evaluation system or resource that can actually do an effective job of examining the attendance. I just don't understand and accept that
So
as a
Mr. Dean,
final.
I didn't say that we didn't have an evaluation. The program has been evaluated, and one of the findings was that the attendance was so sporadic that it was hard for them to make an assumption around it. It's not that we never had an evaluation of Summer Boost.
Who did the evaluation?
I can't remember the name of the group. Dr. Dwyer is not on the call tonight, but he can give you the name of the group. We've had evaluations for it, and when we looked at the evaluation, the attendance was such a significant factor that they couldn't make an assertion around impact. Because right now we encourage attendance, but attendance is not mandatory. And so students come in and out, and we don't create a system where we say, well, because you weren't here, you can't return. And so people may come for a day 1 week, 2 days the following week. We may not see them for the third week, the fourth week. They may show up on Friday for, the field trips. And so it's just very sporadic. But it's not that we don't have an evaluation. It's that the attendance was a major factor in trying to determine the impact of the treatment.
We have a written evaluation.
The company had presented an evaluation in the past. We've not seen one for this year, but I could get Dr. Dwyer to share with you what it is that we had seen from the evaluation before. But it's
I
not
would
that
like
we
to
do not
see
have
the
an
evaluation.
evaluation. It's that was one of the findings of the evaluation.
I would like to see the
Sure,
evaluation.
I'll make sure Dr. Dwyer gets it to you, Mr. Dean.
The charter school expenditures, we get a lump sum presentation of what the charter school expenditures were, but we don't get a detailed breakout of the charter school expenditures. Is that forthcoming, Mr. Joseph?
No one has ever requested that, but in terms of detailed breakout, what do you mean? Because all of the expenditures are just tuition rate that we pay.
Are
to
they
the
exactly the same as the our own expenditures?
Our own expenditures are taken into account in that formula, but there are certain expenditure categories that are removed, and then it's a standard formula that the state creates, and we complete that sheet, and we do that calculation, and then we provide it to the state. They post those rates, and we pay that same rate to charter schools, regardless of whether they're cyber charters or brick and mortar charters. And there's one rate for regular education students and one rate for special education students.
So we just pay a rate. We don't pay based on approved budgeted expenditures. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's the way it's been since the start of charter schools in PA, that it's based on the sending district's expenditures.
We have a new governor. I guess this is to you, Dr. Walters. And I wonder whether or not he has given any signals as to whether or not he is satisfied with the operation of charter schools, how much they cost, how poorly they are evaluated, how poorly they perform. Yet he has provided a significant increase in funding to Pittsburgh public schools. Am I right about that?
You're right that we did get an increase in funding for public education, and I have received no signals from the governor at this point.
So we don't have any indication of whether or not the governor would be friendly or not friendly to any suggestions we might have for how we change the funding of charter schools in Pennsylvania.
I cannot speak to that part. I mean, we can certainly share our recommendations and ideas with the governor, but I have no indication of his stance on whether he'd be open or not open to that.
I think that might be helpful. I think we ought to not just sit back and accept uh, the way charter schools affect our budget. I think the governor and the state ought to be receiving significant pushback from us with recommendations for specific changes that would improve the relationship between ourselves and charter schools.
Thanks for that recommendation, Mr. Dean. I think that's potentially something that might fit better in the government relations committee as a discussion about how we advocate to our local and state officials. Did you have any other questions about the anticipated 2025 budget?
Well, I'm talking about the budget, yes.
So, Mr. Dean, just briefly, when we go to Harrisburg, we do advocacy around public education with our government relations team. And we will continue to do that with our legislators as well with the governor's office.
The increase that we received from the state in public education, will any of that be absorbed by our charter school expenditures, or will all of that be available for improving Pittsburgh Public Schools?
Mr. Dean, the projected budget has a $20.8 million deficit, so there isn't an account for any surplus funding to make additional investments. Right now, the budget assumes that the budget, for lack of better terms, is a status quo budget that largely builds on the same assumptions from last year. And while we do receive additional revenue from the state, it does help to offset those increase in expenditures, but we still are at a $20.8 million deficit.
Thank you.
Did you have any other questions, Mr. Dean?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Walker, I see you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Ms. Yord. Ron, I don't know if you stated it in the presentation, but could you remind us the impact of the tax diversion that we are sending to the state for the coming year? Or not to the state, to the city for the coming year?
I did not state it. I believe we had estimated for the current year and last year's, when we approved the budget last year, that it was about $23 million.
Okay.
But as
And
we collect more revenue beyond what we budgeted, then more of that gets diverted.
Okay. And then, so since you're anticipating an increase in earned income revenue for 25, then it's safe to assume that that 23 million is going to grow. If we're doing the math, it'll be more. So I asked the question because I think we spend a lot of time talking about, charter schools and things like that, but we've not spent a ton of time talking about like at least publicly, about what are the efforts that need to happen in order to help change that law that in effect would have eliminated our deficit for this year, almost, for this year and potentially for next year. So, I know that the government relations has been working working to have conversations with the city. Myself and Dr. Walters and Ms. Talaferro took a trip to Harrisburg recently to talk to legislators. So I make this comment to inform everyone that there is a big chunk of money out there that should be coming to Pittsburgh Public Schools to help support our students' education that is currently going elsewhere. And while our efforts have been slow, I think it would be helpful to remind folks that there is a public interest in helping and working with us to help change that law so that that money stops being diverted. My other question, and if you don't have the answer today, that's okay. But I think when we get to the budget, the releasing the budget, I think it'll be important. The employee costs, so our salaries that are the largest part. Do you have a sense for how many of those positions are still open and unfilled? And like, is there a breakdown of like, is it teachers, clerical, administrative?
I don't have it off the top of my head right now, but that's something we can get. I'll work with HR to get a listing of those and then take the next step while they'll show all vacancies and try to figure out which one of those vacancies are tied to the funded by the general fund.
Okay. I think that's it for now. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Are there any other questions from other board members? I don't see any other hands raised.
Tracy Reed's hand is up.
Yeah,
I just raised my hand. So I just wanted to, I wanted to get some information about like what our projected deficit was for this year and what we're likely to end up with this year. But like where we're likely to be this year.
So I believe I stated that earlier in the presentation. So
Yeah.
we're projecting, I believe, a $29.9 million deficit, and we are projecting to be at 2.6 based on budget to actual information that through September 30th.
Okay. And so I just wanted to say that again out loud. And then when we're thinking about doing away with Summer Boost, what are the steps that we're taking to ensure that kids will still have access to not just the kids who have the greatest need, but kids who may have participated in Summer Boost? Like, how are we working with partners to make sure that there is still access to summer learning opportunities for Pittsburgh Public School students?
So we have started a communications plan first with, we spoke with the Pittsburgh Federation of Teachers to share with them, and we spoke with the mayor to share around those programs as well. And we plan to run a communications plan. Obviously, we've never been an entity that guaranteed all summer programming for all students in the city, but we'll continue to encourage them to partner and understand that while we're reevaluating this space, we encourage them to create summer programming if they can. Many of the summer programs in our city come at a cost. We did not have a cost for our students, so I'm not sure what that impact would be for families, but we will certainly encourage our partners to engage in summer programming and even look at, spaces where we don't have renovations happening in our schools, if they'd like to use those spaces through our permitting process to look at that option as well.
Okay, thank you.
And some schools still do run their own summer programming, and that of course is not going to stop.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. If there are no other questions from other board members, I'll jump in with a few and allow people some time to collect their thoughts. Ms. Taliaferro.
Thank you, Director Yord. This is just a quick, I get it's a question-ish. That makes sense. But I know in that the last slide that you had up, or the slide before the last slide you had up, the one, I'm essentially about to ask a question about the no changes in the 25-26 school year, whichever slide that was, Mr. Joseph.
I think that was slide 24, Ms. Talaferro, where we say that we're assuming no school closures or school renovations for the 25-26 school year.
Yeah, so I know that, so that's listed in the slide, but I'm just wondering, Dr. Walters, if you could just speak a little bit more about that, because as we've been doing this facilities utilization planning work for the past several months, this is a point of concern for most of our families that that we are preparing for a 25-26 school year like start to closures. So if you could just speak or give some clarification around that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, so as directed by the board, we were supposed to look at feasibility initially and then try to give some guidance around that. We're still in that process because there are multiple layers to addressing feasibility. And so since Mr. Joseph had to continue with his timeline around the budget process, I encouraged him to make it as it was no changes for the next school year. It may come to that, but we're continuing that feasibility study. And once we have that ready for the board, we will share that with the board so that they can have that information.
Okay, thank
But
you.
we've not completed that process yet.
Do you have, by chance, if not, it's fine, but do you have like an estimated time frame of when you might just get something, some point of clarity?
Yeah,
'Cause
so initially, our initial just base, we hope to have something to the board by the end of November. But the more comprehensive one that speaks to timelines, we would definitely need more time to think through that.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's all the questions I have, Director Yord. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Joseph, just two quick questions from me, I think, to close us out this evening. First, for the edification of any public, constituents that may be watching, on slide 14, you've got that great pie chart where you highlight the different payment categories or budget categories for expenditures. And 260 plus million of that is going to schools. Can you clarify for the board and people who may be watching what expenditures fall under that broader schools category? Because I know it's not just the maintenance of our buildings.
So I'm attempting to share that slide again. Is this a slide?
Yes.
Okay, let me enlarge it. Okay, so that's not the maintenance of our buildings. The maintenance of our buildings is actually broken out into the operations category. So this would be the staff in all of our schools, any of the school-based expenditures. So basically all of our school-based staff, any of the spending that's directly included, directly funding school-based programs, not specifically the building operation. So this largely is staffing and supplies to run our schools with all of the staff that are allocated directly to the school. So it doesn't include food service staff. It doesn't include our maintenance staff, our custodial staff. So this would be teachers, principals, paras, social workers, nurses.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarification. And then my other question / comment is about the just the differences in our projections at the beginning of the year. I know at the beginning of 2024, we were projecting a large deficit, and now we're projecting ending with a small surplus. And then this 2025 budget is also projecting a large deficit. And this may not be a question you can answer at this point, but just curious about how we are thinking about revising our projections so that they're more in line with what our actuals are. Having that big deficit at the beginning of the year and then making a $30 million switch for it to be a surplus is a large swing. So how are we trying to account for that swing as we go forward? And do you have any insight at this point, and you may not, as to what's playing a role in why we're projecting such a big deficit, but then ending up with a surplus at the end of the year, or potentially ending up with a surplus at the end of the year?
Yeah, sure. So underestimating earned income revenue, so trying to, looking at the way we project our earned income revenue, so to project the delinquent earned income as well as the current earned income separately and taking into account their rates of growth. So that's one thing, being less conservative on the revenue projection side when it comes to assuming for growth from state budget sources. So before in the past, we would keep it at level funding with what we got the previous year. And if we had any increases, that's an increase. So that's $3 million to the good, but that's something that you're not accounting for in terms of your projections. When it comes to ESSER, we don't have ESSER anymore, but ESSER was able to be something that we could utilize for expenditures that had been budgeted in the general fund, as well as any additional ready to learn money that we got from the state, which we're budgeting staff members in that going forward. So it's not going to come as a surprise when we get an increase, and we kind of know what increases we're going to get or what funding we should get. So that's one of the ways that we've gone better. So we look every month, try to break down over the past couple of years what have been the large areas of variation from budget projection from every single year, and dig deeper into that to figure out how can we revise those projections going forward, going through expenditure categories, see what line items haven't been used from year to year to eliminate those. So that's how we're doing a better job in getting our projections better. And one thing is, if you are like, one of the things is when you have unaccounted revenue that comes in from the state that you weren't planning on, or at that degree that you weren't planning on, it creates additional revenue that you have to utilize by a specific period of time. So I'd rather use that revenue to improve our financial position, as opposed to in a manner where I'm sticking to the projection and wanting to make my projections look good, as opposed to our overall general financial position. So every month, refining our projections just to make sure that we're getting better, and not having big influxes of funding tends to help with that.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Joseph. Last call for any questions from board members. If there are no further questions, thank you, Mr. Joseph, for this presentation. This has been the November Business and Finance Committee
You
meeting.
didn't hear me, but I had a question for Mr. Weiss.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Udine.
Thank you, sorry. Ira, do you have any indication of where the governor stands on filling the vacancies in the charter school? That commission that oversees appeals, charter school appeals, and how the governor stands on how we're funding charter schools. Do you know whether or not or do you get any information that suggests whether or not the governor has a different view about how we fund charter schools?
The governor did appoint some new members to the Charter Appeals Board shortly after he took office.
Were they friendly or unfriendly?
Well, I would say that the prior board under Governor Wolf that was there before the change was a little more favorably disposed to the school districts. There was this change in cyber funding that Mr. Joseph alluded to, that the governor supported, but I believe that he's never stated what his position on charters is. He has made pretty clear that he is more receptive to school choice than his predecessor, but beyond that, I don't know what his position is on funding, but there's no, I mean, the legislature, this session ends next month, so there'll be no charter reform coming until the new year, and we'll see what he proposes in his budget address, which I believe is in February.
I think it would be helpful if we got some issues in front of him while he's considering his plan for next year and started a dialogue with him relative to how we do charter schools in Pennsylvania. I think that would be helpful. Thank you, Ms. Yord.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Yes, Mr. Walker. Then
Thanks.
Ms.
Yeah.
Caldera.
Sully, you reminded me of my last question that I completely forgot about. And this is also for Mr. Weiss. If you could give us, as we continue to deal with, decreasing real estate revenue, can you give us an idea of where we are with the county and the tax reassessment issue that we've been working on?
The county filed what are called preliminary objections to our lawsuit, claiming the district has no standing to sue. That means it has no injury. We believe that is really a meritless position. The judge asked for supplemental briefs by, I guess it'd be Wednesday, which we are filing, which clearly demonstrate that the school district does have standing to bring this action, and that there are numerous other cases around the state where taxing bodies have brought similar actions. And we're confident that the case will proceed beyond this point. I believe once these preliminary objections are resolved, the case proceeds to the merits. Hopefully we can have a productive discussion with counsel for the county to see if we can find a way to get this done expeditiously, because as Mr. Joseph noted in his presentation, this isn't getting any better.
Yeah, and then do you have? I think right now are we still the only district involved in this suit, or have we had some other surrounding districts join us in this effort?
We're the only district. We've reached out to all districts in the county. I think the districts are awaiting the outcome of these objections to see if this case will proceed. But it also may be that once this case proceeds, the judge to whom it is assigned will take the same approach Judge Weddick did many years ago and basically order all the taxing bodies into the case as parties. That's what he did. Then he created what was called a core defense committee of counsel to handle the case. Our office led that as we represented Mr. Clifton, who brought the lawsuit in 2005.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I think. Thank you to Mr. Dean for jogging my memory there, because, as we work through this kind of complex budget season and thinking about what are all the levers that we need to pull to actually make this work, while we're waiting on, the analysis of the facilities work to see what that'll do, not just from a student outcomes standpoint, but also, potentially a budgetary standpoint. We also have to look at all these other measures that we can do before we get to the point where we consider raising the millage like we did 3 years ago. So I appreciate that, and hopefully after Wednesday and whenever the judge does with his or her thing, we have a better idea of where we're moving forward, because 15 years without tax reassessments is kind of crazy, and while I'm probably benefiting from it as a homeowner, I'm okay paying a little bit more for what my home is worth to ensure that education can continue in Pittsburgh. So I will stop there. I think that's my last one, Miss Yord.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Ms. Taliaferro?
Thank you, Director Yord. So I just wanted to chime in just quickly with some of the comments that were made by Mr. Udine, and Mr. Walker also brought up the earned income tax. So we met with our government relations committee last week, and two of the agenda items were to have some conversation around the direction that we want to go in to address the earned income tax money, and as well as setting priorities or kind of what we want to focus on in the governor's budget for 2025. Those two pieces I asked to be put on our executive agenda to be able to discuss how the board wants to move forward with these two things, so that the committee can then give directive to our government relations firm. So your questions, while they might not necessarily be completely tied to the budget, are being addressed in the government relations committee. And we will be looking for the board to give voice on kind of what direction we want to be focusing on, while also working with the administration on the budgetary needs that the district has. So you should stay tuned to that. Hopefully you'll be able to add some voice to that conversation when we get there. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions from the board, I would like to thank Mr. Joseph. I would like to thank Mr. Joseph for his presentation this evening and call this meeting to adjourn. Everybody have a good evening, and we will see you next Tuesday, not tomorrow, for the Education Committee meeting. Thank you, everyone.